Good morning. It's Thursday, May the 7th, and this is The Drill. Thank you very much. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today, because I don't take my cues from the left. I don't speak extemporaneously, but script my podcasts. I will not pretend to be neutral. I will not simply give you the facts and let you decide, and I will not get in your psyche. I'm partisan, and I'm here to convince and persuade. I created this podcast to answer the question most asked by conservatives, namely, what can I do? My podcast is short, approximately 5 to 10 minutes long, because shorter podcasts are easier to download and listen to, and shorter podcasts force me to get to the point. I've been listening to conservative talk radio since 1989. I've grown up in a socialist household and have seen the destructive effects of socialism up close and personal. My podcast is made available through Spreaker and can be heard on iTunes, Spotify, Google, and YouTube. Today, what can I do? Quote of the day, and why it is that I hate it when other guys call me boss. All that when I come back. Thank you. What can I do? Make the presumption for the status quo. Don't spread the disease. Resist subversion. Don't give in to the pressure to prove a negative. Mind your own business. Listen and read carefully. Criticize. Trust yourself. Be realistic. Learn to love the concept and abstraction, and don't be reactionary. Next up, the quote of the day. Thank you. The quote of the day comes from the Urban Dictionary. Boss, a disingenuous form of address used by insolent little twats, which although ostensibly deferential, actually implies that they don't actually have any respect for you at all. All right, boss. Thanks, boss. Up next, an article from Men's Health by Sean O'Neill. Thank you. This episode of The Drill is going to last longer. It's going to be longer than it normally is. Normally it's about 5 to 10 minutes, but this is going to go on probably maybe twice as long because this segment of the episode is I'm reading from an article in Men's Health magazine, and it's rather lengthy. And this segment of this episode is in two parts. Today I will read an article. The article from Men's Health magazine written by Sean O'Neill, a lefty. And next episode I will analyze the article and tell you how I know that the author is a lefty by the way that he writes. Why I hate it when other guys call me boss. I'm nobody's boss. Granted, I'm a writer. Nobody listens to me. But even when I have, technically, been in charge of other people, not one of them has ever called me boss. In fact, in my entire professional career, I've only reliably been called boss by one person. The guy who worked at the salad place near my old office. Every afternoon, he'd greet me with, "What's up, boss?" A mere prelude to a litany of mini-bosses as we walked the ice tray gauntlet together. "Chickpeas, boss?" he'd ask, coming off like a low-level mafioso asking if I wanted him to rough somebody up. Or maybe Paul Newman in Cool Hand Luke seeking my permission to break off from the chain gang for a ladle of water. He was always affable enough, and I never suspected that he meant anything by it, and yet I always found the experience vaguely humiliating, for reasons I could not fully explain. As it turns out, I'm not alone. The forums of Reddit, Quora, and Yahoo Answers are filled with men, it's always men, asking other men whether they should be honored, amused, or offended. Quote, "It's meant to insult you without you realizing it," unquote, some say. Quote, "It's just slang, get over it," unquote, others counter. As far as appellations go, everyone seems to agree that, quote, boss, unquote, isn't nearly as aggressive as chief, which was an implicit asshole long before the memes made it official. And personally speaking, I'll always take boss over big guy, another faux submissive colloquialism that just seems to be a cutesy way of saying you're fat or freakishly tall. But boss still rankles. When I pulled that modern authority on civil discourse, a bunch of randos on Twitter, the more than 1,500 votes I received were split nearly evenly between those who found the term friendly and sociable and those who thought it was a sly insult. How can such a tiny word create such a huge divide? As with so many things, how you hear boss depends greatly on how it's being said. It's like aloha. It's in the inflection, offered my former coworker critic Scott Tobias. There's also the matter of the words immediately surrounding it, and possibly even the state surrounding you. Few respondents said that they found boss to be a sign of actual deference, suggesting it doesn't convey the same subservience here as it does in, say, India or the Philippines, where it's often used to sweet-talk tourists. Context, tone, and regional dialect can all be a factor in why you're the boss. And of course, you should always ask yourself whether you're Bruce Springsteen. But finding it churlish or chummy mostly depends on whether you're chums already. Sometimes boss is a sign of respect. For folks who are friendly, it's a sign of respect, says therapist Dr. Alan Smiler, a prominent researcher on masculinity. Guys are attuned to power. We watch sports, and we know who the captain is, who the coach is. We learn this in scouting, in the military, in movies, those very clear hierarchies. We're taught to respect the hierarchy. We talk about who's a real man and who's a wannabe, who's a nerd or a poser. We get this from a fairly young age, and if it's somebody you're buddies with, we see boss as a sign of respect. It's saying you have some authority. It's only when they are a stranger that things get murky, particularly when the stranger is, in fact, carrying out some task for you. In a customer service situation where you are technically bossing them around, boss can be an acknowledgement of the power that you hold over another person, however limited. But whether that acknowledgement is sincere or grudging largely depends on how you choose to interpret it. Boss can also be a form of manipulation. Quote, a lot of initial language when strangers meet has to do with establishing position with one another, unquote, says Jay Heinrichs, a New York Times bestselling author on persuasion. Quote, calling somebody boss can be interpreted by somebody as ironic, but if not, it's actually great because it puts them in this state that behavioral economists call cognitive ease. That makes them more persuadable, unquote. Heinrich says a salesperson calling you boss implies that you have more agency than you actually have. Quote, they're saying, I'm totally gonna manipulate this guy, but make him think that he's in charge. And it can be a way of saying, yeah, you're my boss technically, but by stating that awareness first, I'm the one who's expressing power here, unquote. That's the mocking part of it. It's ironic hyperbole. It's a form of exaggeration that's not fully meant. The person saying boss generally isn't in power, but is trying to express a kind of power. In other words, boss can be a sarcastic expression of resentment at having to cede power, or a subversive way of flexing about who really has it. And even when employed as flattery, it's often only there to exploit you. So in that sense, maybe being annoyed by boss can just be attributed to your own shrewdness, a gut reaction to oily sales tactics and deceit. That word would certainly make me feel better. Maybe I'm only put off by being called boss because I'm far too smart for such cheap rhetorical ploys, not because I'm a hypersensitive, over-analytical wiener who scans every human interaction looking for petty slights. Hooray! Or maybe the perceived slight is all in your head. Unfortunately, whatever sad gratification I might have taken from that was soon dashed by Dr. Smiler, who told me that he doesn't really see boss as a means of establishing dominance, at least not knowingly. Quote, there's a certain certainly a way in which it comes across as an attempt to assert power or point out a lack of power, but I'd be surprised if it's really intended, unquote. Smiler counters. Quote, in that kind of retail scenario, it's about the customer's response, but there's also a piece there about the employee or service provider not necessarily being aware of their audience. The use of hierarchy as a way to establish familiarity works for guys who are fairly stereotypical, but it doesn't necessarily work for women or for guys who have opted out of the man box or who never really fit in there, unquote. So maybe the salad guy was only trying to talk to me man to man, and because I don't actually feel like one, I just assumed that he was being mocking. Perhaps my latent insecurity over my own inherent lack of bossness, my innate fears of where I actually rank on that proverbial hierarchy, the fact that when I rap along to Rick Ross, I feel like a fraud, maybe all of these contribute to one fragile Fabergé egg of an ego, one easily shattered by something as innocuous as boss. Is it really something as cliched and primitive as a threat to my masculinity? Quote, I don't know if it's a threat, but it's definitely related to masculinity, unquote, says Dr. Sapna Cherian, a psychology professor at the University of Washington, whose 2015 study, Manning Up, looks at men's tendency to overcompensate. Quote, stereotypes about leaders are masculine. People think the best types of leadership qualities are masculine, even though research shows that that's not true. And I would wonder whether this is about the pressure to gender things in a masculine way that men have with each other, like calling each other man. It's almost like, I see your masculinity, I'm acknowledging it so we can move on, unquote. Still, Cherian hesitates to say for certain that anyone reacting poorly to being called boss is because they doubt their own manhood. Quote, if you found it condescending, it could just be because you find it inappropriate or because you're being reduced to that identity, unquote, she says. Quote, especially in American culture, that feeling of being boxed in to a certain identity makes people feel uncomfortable. You just feel like you're being pigeonholed and you react negatively to that, unquote. History may also play a part in your discomfort. Indeed, part of what makes boss such a fraught bit of lingo is right in the word. It's a holdover from the slave days, a word borrowed from the Dutch baas, which was first used primarily by freed men and women as a substitute for master. The connotation lingered as boss, then made its way into the prison system, where it became a common way for prisoners to address the guards. Even without that subtext, however, boss also suggests a submissiveness that some might take umbrage at on a similarly ethical level, believing boss to be a word reserved solely for the privileged. Still, as much as I'd like to think that I've bristled at boss out of some affront to my Tom Joad-like standing as a friend of the common man, I'm not sure that fully explains it either. For those who don't like being called boss, perhaps it's an internalized understanding of the word's loaded history, or a cynical suspicion of the intention behind it, or their own neurotic insecurity, or possibly all of the above, subsumed into a single instinctual recoiling. And yes, it will always depend on how well you know the other person and how it sounds coming out of their mouth, and even maybe where you're standing. But whatever the situation, it's always up to the boss to decide whether to be flattered or offended. And clearly, some of us just don't want the job. So if you want to err on the side of caution, maybe stick with sir or man or person I respect unequivocally, or hey, even nothing at all. Quote, the recipient may not want some sort of casual connection with, say, a service provider, unquote, Smiler says. Quote, they're like, just do your job. Don't try to create a relationship with me, unquote. Whatever you say, boss. Back in a minute. Thank you. Who is a true conservative? He is the person that has the courage of his convictions and is confident in what he knows. He is the person that understands that cultural conservatism is more important than political conservatism. He's not selfish, but minds his own business. He acts like an adult. He's patriotic and uses common sense. He expresses what he knows and does so with certainty. He makes judgments, refuses to speculate, speaks clearly and definitively, and is not afraid to say no. He's open-minded, asking why rather than why not. He is consistent, credible, and influential, not ashamed of his existence, unafraid to learn or correct his mistakes. He is a normal American, and he is better than the socialist. He's a better friend, father, brother, family member, and a better person, period. You have to know that. If you don't know with every fiber of your being that being a true conservative is best, then you're wasting your time. And that brings me to the end of another episode of The Drill. Remember that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win. Think about it.